His hands were shaking, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake, a big one. The backup officer glanced over the paperwork quickly and then at the woman. "This doesn't seem right." The woman sighed softly. "I'm afraid it's not. But you'll understand soon enough." Dwayne didn't answer. His mind was racing. He was still processing her words from earlier. A judge? Was she really? The backup officer raised an eyebrow. "What did she say to you?" Dwayne finally spoke, his voice quieter now. She said she's a judge. A sitting judge." The backup officer froze. The silence hung in the air for a beat too long. "A judge," he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "Yeah," Dwayne muttered. He felt his face flush. "And I arrested her." For the first time, the woman spoke again. "I'm Judge Jackson. And you just violated my rights." Dwayne glanced at her, feeling the weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. Judge Jackson. The woman in front of him wasn't just some person off the street, she was a respected public official, someone who commanded authority in a courtroom. And here he was, standing in front of her, holding her in cuffs like she was a criminal. The backup officer stepped closer. "Dwayne, I think we need to call this in." Dwayne felt his stomach churn. He wasn't sure how to explain this. How to explain the gut-wrenching feeling in his chest, the confusion in his mind. He opened his mouth to speak but was interrupted by the sharp buzz of his radio. "Dwayne, what's going on?" The voice from dispatch was tight with concern. "I need help," Dwayne said quietly, his heart racing. I need to talk to my superior." On it, the dispatcher replied immediately, a note of urgency in her voice. Dwayne turned back to Judge Jackson, who stood still, her gaze unwavering. She said nothing, but her silence felt heavy, full of meaning. The backup officer looked back and forth between them before finally speaking again. "Dwayne, I think you should call this off. You've made a mistake. We need to let her go." Dwayne's jaw clenched. Let her go? He couldn't understand how this was happening. He had been so sure of his actions earlier, but now, everything seemed like a blur. The sirens were still blaring in the background, and as more units arrived, Dwayne realized something he hadn't expected: the arrest he'd made was about to spiral into something far bigger than he ever anticipated. The sound of sirens continued to echo, but now they were muted by the tension inside the scene. Dwayne stood frozen, his mind spinning in confusion as he watched the backup officer carefully examine the situation. The arrival of more units didn't make him feel better, it made him feel like the walls were closing in. The air was thick with uncertainty as the backup officer stepped aside, making a call on his radio. Dwayne was left standing there. The arrest had become a symbol, not just of one officer's mistake, but of the larger systemic issues within law enforcement. Dwayne's face still appeared in news segments, but now, it was the face of reform. Some people saw him as a hero, someone who had faced the consequences of his actions, learned from them, and used his position to change the system. Others, however, still questioned his intentions. The media scrutiny intensified, and there were whispers among his colleagues about his loyalties, his relationship with Judge Jackson, and whether he had become too much of an activist cop. The internal struggle weighed heavily on Dwayne. He had dedicated so much of his life to law enforcement, and now it felt like the very profession he had sworn to uphold was turning against him. He knew the fight wasn't just with the public, it was also with the forces within his own department that resisted change. One evening, as Dwayne was going through his reports, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his fellow officers. It read, "What's your real agenda, Dwayne? You're not one of us anymore." The message stung. He sat there, staring at the screen, his heart heavy with doubt. Was he still the officer he once was? Had he become something different, something his colleagues couldn't understand or accept? Dwayne stood up, pushing the chair back with frustration. No, he told himself. This is who I am. A public stand. The tipping point came when Dwayne was invited to speak at a citywide meeting about police reform. This wasn't just a departmental discussion, it was a chance to speak to the entire city, to advocate for real change in law enforcement policies. The night of the meeting, Dwayne stood in front of the large crowd, his heart pounding. The room was packed, people who had been impacted by police actions, activists, city officials, and fellow officers. It was one of the largest gatherings of its kind in the city's history, and Dwayne knew that his words would be closely scrutinized. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Tonight, I stand before you as a man who has made mistakes, he began, his voice steady. But also as a man who has learned from those mistakes. I've been given the rare chance to see the truth, and now, I can't unsee it. I've spent my entire life in law enforcement, but I didn't truly understand what it meant to serve the people. I didn't understand the harm we could cause, the biases that clouded our judgment. There was a murmur through the crowd, but Dwayne pressed on. I know there are some who think that reform is impossible, that we're too far gone to change. But I am proof that it's never too late. We can change, but it has to start with us. It has to start with each individual officer recognizing their role in the system. And it has to start with us listening, truly listening, to the people we serve. A pattern he had never noticed before, something that had shaped the way he interacted with the world. I never thought about it like that, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Jackson nodded, her gaze never wavering. Most people don't. And that's the problem. You were just doing your job, right? But in your mind, I wasn't just a person, I was a suspect. And I'm not the only one. There are hundreds of people out there, everyday people, who get treated the same way. Dwayne swallowed hard, guilt welling up inside of him. I don't want to be like that, he said. I don't want to think that way. Judge Jackson's expression softened, but there was still a firm resolve in her voice. Then you've got to do something about it. You've got to learn to see people for who they are, not for what you think they are. There was a long pause before she spoke again. This time, her voice was quieter, more reflective. You're lucky. You have a chance to make this right. Not just for me, but for the whole system. Because if you don't change, if you don't acknowledge these biases and work to fix them, you're just part of the problem. Dwayne's heart raced. This conversation was no longer just about him and his career, it was about a larger issue, an issue that stretched beyond the walls of the precinct. And the realization hit him hard, he had to change, not just for himself, but for the people he had sworn to protect. I don't even know where to start, Dwayne admitted. How do I unlearn this? How do I fix something that feels so ingrained? Judge Jackson's gaze softened, her tone more reassuring. It's not going to be easy. But the first step is realizing you have a problem. The second is doing something about it. And the third, well, that's where the real work begins. Dwayne nodded slowly, the enormity of the task ahead of him sinking in. What do you want me to do? He asked, the uncertainty still lingering in his voice. Start by listening. Start by hearing the stories of the people you've been trained not to see. And then take those stories, and let them change you. But most of all, don't stop learning. This isn't something you can fix overnight. But you can start today. And that's what matters. She stood up and extended her hand. You have a choice, officer. You can learn, or you can stay the same. But if you want to make a difference, you've got to commit to the hard work. Dwayne reached out and shook her hand, his grip firm, but his mind still racing. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. The next few weeks were a blur of self-reflection, conversations with colleagues, and a deep dive into resources about racial bias, justice, and systemic inequality. Dwayne wasn't naive, he knew this wasn't going to be easy. But he also knew that he had to take responsibility, not just for his actions. The weight of her words lingered. He knew she was right. He had acted without thinking. He had assumed that because she was a black woman driving a luxury car at night, she had to be doing something wrong. He had failed to see her as an individual. Dwayne had never considered himself racist. He had never imagined that he carried these kinds of biases. But now, looking at everything that had happened, he couldn't deny it. The truth was staring him in the face. He put his phone down, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. There was no going back now. His career, his reputation, everything was on the line. The chief's office. The next morning, Dwayne was called into the chief's office. The air felt heavier than usual as he stepped inside. The chief, a man who had always been stern but fair, looked up from his desk. "Sit down, Dwayne," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Dwayne did, his legs heavy with dread. The chief didn't say anything at first. He just studied Dwayne for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "We've been getting calls from the mayor's office, the media, even from other departments. They're asking questions. And to be honest, I don't have all the answers." Dwayne's stomach churned. He hadn't expected it to hit him like this, so fast, so hard. He had hoped he could fix this before it blew up in his face. "I'm sorry, Chief," Dwayne said quietly. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know. I acted without thinking." The chief didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I've been reading your file, Dwayne. You've got a good record. You've been with us for years. But this? This is bad. You arrested a judge. You didn't even recognize who she was." Dwayne nodded, feeling the weight of the chief's words settle on him. "I know. I saw a black woman driving a nice car at night. I assumed she was doing something wrong. I thought she was a criminal." The chief's eyes narrowed. "Do you understand how dangerous that kind of thinking is? Do you realize the damage it does to the public's trust in us? In you?" Dwayne opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had no excuse for what he had done. The truth was, he had been acting on his assumptions, on his training, but also on his own biases he hadn't even realized he was carrying until it was too late. "I understand," he said finally, his voice small. The chief leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to understand something, Dwayne. You've got a choice to make now. You can own up to what you've done, learn from this, and do the work it takes to change, or you can let this mistake define you." Dwayne felt the sting of the chief's words, but he also knew deep down that this was his chance to do the right thing. If he stayed on the force, it wouldn't be the same. It couldn't be. His hand still clenching the cuffs on Judge Jackson's wrists, his breath shallow and rapid. "Dwayne," the backup officer said gently, his voice full of caution, "you need to think about what you've done here." Dwayne's thoughts were a whirlwind, and he opened his mouth to speak but found he didn't have the words. The overwhelming sense of wrongness had crept over him, and all he could think about was the woman in front of him, Judge Jackson. What had he done? He had a job to do, and he thought he was doing it right, but now he was beginning to question everything. The truth was slowly settling in, he had made a huge mistake. He looked at Judge Jackson, her calmness almost unnerving. She hadn't flinched when the cuffs went on, hadn't raised her voice. She just stood there, silent, her gaze unwavering. She was no criminal. She wasn't even close to what he had thought she was. "I didn't mean to," Dwayne finally muttered, the words heavy with regret. Judge Jackson's eyes softened, and for the first time since he'd put the cuffs on her, she spoke with more warmth in her voice. "I know you didn't, officer. But your actions have consequences. You'll have to learn from them. Dwayne's throat tightened. How was he supposed to learn from this? How could he face the department after this? How could he undo what he had done? His mind raced, but Judge Jackson remained silent, her eyes still holding him in place. A few minutes later, the supervisor arrived, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked from Dwayne to Judge Jackson, and then back to Dwayne with a sense of authority that was almost too much to handle. "Dwayne," he said, his voice low but firm, "what the hell is going on here?" Dwayne stammered, his mind a blur. He glanced at Judge Jackson again, but this time, she did not meet his gaze. Instead, she looked off into the distance, waiting for the inevitable fallout. He knew now that his career, his reputation, and his credibility were at risk. She said she's a judge," Dwayne finally blurted, his voice shaking with uncertainty. "A judge?" The supervisor paused, as if trying to process the information. He turned to Judge Jackson, his face now showing clear signs of distress. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're going to sort this out right now." The supervisor quickly removed the cuffs from Judge Jackson's wrists, his hands moving awkwardly, as if unsure how to make amends for the mistake. Judge Jackson said nothing as she rubbed her wrists, but her presence loomed larger in the room than it ever had before. "I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding," the supervisor continued, now speaking directly to her. "We're going to get this sorted out, and I'll make sure there's no further issue." Judge Jackson took a deep breath, then looked at Dwayne for the first time. "I understand that you were just doing your job, officer. But you need to ask yourself, why did you pull me over in the first place?" He had to confront his mistakes, and more importantly, he had to confront the prejudices he had been carrying with him all these years. The chief's voice softened slightly. "You'll be put on administrative leave for the next few weeks while we figure out the next steps. But when you come back, if you come back, you'll have a lot of work to do. Not just to regain trust, but to change the way you see the world." Dwayne nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I will, Chief. I promise." Judge Jackson's request that afternoon, Dwayne was called into the precinct's conference room, where he found a familiar face waiting for him, Judge Jackson. She stood as he entered, her posture still regal, her expression calm. "Judge Jackson," Dwayne began, his voice hesitant. I'm so sorry for what happened. I never meant for any of this." Judge Jackson held up a hand. "I know, officer. I know." She motioned for him to sit. Dwayne took a seat across from her, trying to maintain composure. "You've been through enough already," Judge Jackson said quietly. "But there's something I want to make clear." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "This isn't just about you. This is about the system. This is about the way people like you, people in power, see people like me." Dwayne shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't see you as a judge. I just saw someone I thought was out of place." Judge Jackson's eyes softened, but the weight of her words was heavy. "And that's the problem. The assumptions. The quick judgments. They hurt people, real people." Dwayne lowered his gaze. He had heard her words, but it was only now that he truly understood them. He wasn't just apologizing to her. He was apologizing to everyone he had ever judged too quickly, everyone he had labeled because of what he thought they should be. Judge Jackson's words lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. The weight of the conversation seemed to settle around Dwayne like a thick fog. He sat still, lost in his own thoughts, trying to digest the depth of her message. "You don't realize how often this happens," she said, breaking the silence. "How many times people like me are treated like criminals before they even speak. People see the color of my skin, they see the car I'm driving, and they immediately assume I'm out here doing something illegal." Her voice softened slightly, but the determination in her eyes was undeniable. This isn't just about one bad arrest. This is about the assumptions you make every day when you look at someone who doesn't look like you. And until you can change that, nothing will really change. Dwayne's chest tightened, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He had always thought he was doing his job fairly, without bias. But now, sitting in front of the judge, he realized how deeply ingrained his own biases were. The arrest of Judge Jackson wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of something bigger. The absolute lack of fear in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. Dwayne swallowed, suddenly aware of how tight his grip was on her wrist. What had he just done? From behind him, his radio crackled to life. "Dwayne, what's your status?" His mouth was dry. He struggled to find words. The woman, the judge, studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. And just like that, the entire power dynamic had shifted. Dwayne had been in control just moments ago. Now, he wasn't so sure. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and Dwayne snapped out of his trance. "Dwayne, do you copy?" His hands felt clammy as he unclipped his radio. Yeah. I'm here. Everything okay?" The voice on the other end sounded more confused than concerned. Dwayne glanced back at the woman. Her gaze was still calm, almost detached, but her presence suddenly felt overwhelming. He cleared his throat. I need backup," he said, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. There was a long pause before the radio responded. "What's going on, Dwayne? You've got a suspect in custody?" Dwayne swallowed, trying to shake off the sudden wave of doubt. His hands tightened on his cuffs as he stared at the woman. She hadn't moved, hadn't said anything more. She just stood there, calm as ever. Yeah," he said, a little too quickly. "I need someone down here." Before the dispatcher could respond, a car pulled up with its siren blaring in the distance. Dwayne's chest tightened. Backup was finally here. The officer who stepped out of the vehicle didn't look surprised, he looked confused. "Dwayne," he called, his voice a little more concerned now. "What's going on?" Dwayne didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the woman, still standing with her arms behind her back. Her face was unreadable, but the lack of movement suggested she was used to this kind of thing. "Is this woman under arrest?" the backup officer asked, his gaze flicking between Dwayne and the woman. Dwayne hesitated, still wrestling with the shock of the situation. "Yeah, she's being detained for obstruction." The backup officer looked puzzled. "Obstruction? For what? Did she resist arrest?" "No," Dwayne muttered, feeling his frustration building again. "She didn't resist. He trailed off." He realized he wasn't even sure why he was arresting her anymore. He had pulled her over for a routine stop, but now he wasn't so sure about his decisions. The woman spoke again, her voice even but firm. "I understand you're doing your job, officer. But I've committed no crime." Dwayne's eyes flicked to the backup officer, who was still watching the scene unfold. The backup officer was quiet, looking at Dwayne with growing concern. Dwayne," he said slowly. "Can I see your paperwork on this stop?" Dwayne fumbled with his radio and notebook, pulling out the report and handing it over without meeting the officer's eyes. Dwayne was stunned by her calmness. His mind screamed for an answer, but he couldn't find one that sounded right. What had he thought at the time? Had he just assumed that a black woman in a nice car at night was out of place? Had he been influenced by his own biases? His pulse raced as he tried to piece it together. I don't know," he said, his voice small. "I guess I was just. I don't know." Judge Jackson gave a small nod. "That's the problem," she said quietly. "You didn't know. You didn't stop to think. You made assumptions, and now you've made a mistake. Dwayne felt the weight of her words. The shame settled in his chest like a lead weight. He had arrested a judge, yes. But more importantly, he had made assumptions based on who she was, not who she actually was. Before anyone else could speak, Dwayne's radio crackled again. This time, it was the dispatch from headquarters. Dwayne, we've got a problem. The mayor's office is getting involved. Dwayne's heart sank. He had known things were getting bad, but now this? The mayor? The fallout from his mistake was about to go from personal to public. We'll take care of it from here, the supervisor said, signaling for Dwayne to step back. Dwayne did, his eyes still glued to Judge Jackson as she stood tall and composed, despite the events of the last few minutes. Please, don't let this go any further, Judge Jackson said to the supervisor, her voice measured but firm. I don't want a scandal. What I want is for this department to look at itself and make sure this doesn't happen again. The words hung in the air. Dwayne wasn't sure what was worse, the feeling of being exposed, or the realization that the department had been failing in ways he hadn't understood before. As the scene began to clear, Dwayne was left standing there, alone, in the chaos of what he had just witnessed. Judge Jackson had just become his mirror. A mirror reflecting back at him all the biases he hadn't even known he carried. The fallout from the arrest quickly escalated. The news stations picked up the story, and the headlines ran wild with the shocking arrest of a sitting judge by an officer who hadn't even realized who she was. The story spread, and Dwayne's name was plastered everywhere, the scandal drawing scrutiny not just from the public, but from the very people who had trained him. Dwayne sat in his car during his break, staring at his phone. The notifications kept coming, people tagging him in comments, some offering sympathy, others condemning him. Some were even calling for his resignation. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He knew he had made a mistake. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him. But the magnitude of it, the way it had blown up, left him with no idea how to make it right. In the back of his mind, Dwayne kept hearing Judge Jackson's voice. You made assumptions, and now you've made a mistake. After the meeting, the calls began to come in. Other police departments were asking Dwayne to speak. Some were offering to collaborate with him on training programs. Dwayne wasn't naive, he knew that the path ahead would still be difficult. There would still be pushback, still be days when he questioned if the changes were truly taking root. But he also knew that the work was worth it. He had seen firsthand how powerful it could be when people from all walks of life came together for a common purpose, to build trust and ensure justice for all. Judge Jackson's words echoed in his mind, this fight doesn't end. But every step you take toward justice is a step worth taking. And for the first time in his career, Dwayne felt that he was truly on the right path. Months had passed since the citywide meeting, and Dwayne could feel the shift happening around him. It wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect, but change was happening. Slowly, but surely. He had worked hard to earn back the trust of his community and his fellow officers. The new training programs were in full swing, and the department had begun integrating more community-based approaches to policing. Dwayne had not only become an advocate for reform within his department, but he had become a symbol of what was possible when someone admitted their mistakes and took the necessary steps to change. It wasn't just the community that had started to notice. Dwayne had earned the respect of officers who had once been skeptical of his approach. He wasn't just the officer who made a mistake anymore, he was the officer who had worked hard to fix it. And he had done it not by pretending the problem didn't exist, but by acknowledging it head-on and using his position to create real change. One evening, as Dwayne was finishing up some paperwork at the precinct, he was approached by the chief. The chief, who had once been uncertain of Dwayne's plans, now looked at him with something like admiration. Dwayne, the chief said, his voice steady, I've been following the progress you've been making. I want you to know that I'm proud of the work you've done, not just for yourself, but for the entire department." Dwayne blinked in surprise. It wasn't often that he received praise from the chief. It meant more than he had expected. "Thank you, Chief," Dwayne said quietly, feeling the weight of his journey in those 2 words. "But the work's not done yet." The chief nodded. "I know. But I think we're on the right track. And I believe you've shown that change is possible. Real change." A final lesson. A few weeks later, Dwayne received another unexpected call. It was Judge Jackson. Her voice, still calm and composed, came through the phone with a sense of quiet authority. "Dwayne," she began, "I've been watching your progress. The work you've done in the department, the way you've handled yourself, it's impressive. But it was a small victory, a sign that things were shifting. The process of change was slow, but it was starting to work." Facing the community. One of the most important components of the initiative was its outreach to the community. Dwayne had spent weeks arranging meetings with local leaders, organizing town halls, and making sure the public had a direct line of communication with the police department. It wasn't just about listening, it was about hearing their concerns and taking action. The first town hall meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. Dwayne was nervous. He had spoken to officers, city officials, and even family members about what was happening, but this was different. The people who showed up that night were the very individuals who had been impacted by law enforcement for years. They had stories about their experiences, their fears, and their frustrations. As the meeting began, Dwayne stood at the front of the room, facing an audience of community members, mostly Black and Latino families. They didn't hold back, sharing the pain and mistrust that had been built up over generations. "I've been stopped by officers more times than I can count, and it's always the same," one woman said. "You just see me as a criminal. You don't see me as a person." Dwayne's stomach twisted. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing them face to face, from people he had sworn to protect, was different. Another man stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "You all think you can just walk into our neighborhoods and arrest us. Like we're nothing. Why should we trust you?" The words hit Dwayne harder than he expected. They cut through the professional armor he had worn for so long and exposed the truth he had been trying to deny. These weren't just complaints, they were real experiences from people who had been treated as less than human for too long. As the room grew quieter, Dwayne stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I understand your anger," he said, the words coming out more vulnerable than he had planned. "I've been a part of the problem, and I'm sorry. I've seen it in my own actions, and I've felt the weight of that mistake. But I want you to know that things are changing. I am changing." There was a long silence. The room was still. And then, slowly, a few people nodded. Some of the tension seemed to lift, just a little. "I can't fix everything overnight," Dwayne continued, "but I promise you, I'm here to listen. I'm here to learn. And I will do everything I can to make this right." A new path forward. As Dwayne continued his work, more officers joined the initiative, and the resistance began to fade. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still filled with challenges. But Dwayne no longer felt like he was alone in this fight. He had the support of some of his colleagues, the respect of the community, and a newfound sense of purpose. Dwayne's chest swelled with pride, but he knew better than to let the praise settle. "Thank you, Judge. But I'm still learning. This journey, this work, it never really ends, does it?" Judge Jackson chuckled softly. "No, Dwayne. It doesn't. But the fact that you understand that is what makes you different. You're not just fighting for justice now, you're creating it. And that is the difference." Dwayne paused, taking a moment to absorb her words. "I'm not the same person I was when I first met you," he said quietly. "I used to think it was enough just to do my job. But now, now I see that I have a responsibility to do more. I have a responsibility to change the system, to make sure that people aren't treated like I treated you that night." Judge Jackson's voice softened. "That's why you're on the right path, Dwayne. But remember, this fight is never just about one person. It's about all of us working together to make this world a better place. One step at a time." A full circle. Dwayne's life had been irrevocably changed by that one arrest. It was a mistake that had cost him, but it had also given him the opportunity to become something better. As the months passed, Dwayne continued his work, not just within the department, but in the community. He took part in local initiatives, helped to mentor young officers, and spoke at schools and community centers. He wasn't just advocating for a better police force, he was advocating for a better society, where people were seen as human beings first, and not judged based on their appearance or background. The town halls grew larger, the conversations more honest. The officers who had been skeptical now stood beside Dwayne, understanding the need for change and supporting him every step of the way. The people who had once been afraid to speak up now felt like they had a voice that mattered. And Judge Jackson? She remained a constant mentor, a symbol of the change they both believed in. They met regularly, sharing ideas and discussing how they could continue to work together to create a better world for their community. One day, Dwayne stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching as Judge Jackson walked out, her robes flowing behind her. She was a symbol of justice, but not just in the courtroom. Her influence stretched far beyond that, reminding everyone she came in contact with that real change is possible, as long as we are willing to work for it. Dwayne smiled to himself, standing tall as he realized the work he had done and the work that still lay ahead. He had made mistakes, yes. But he had also taken the steps to correct them. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Justice wasn't just about enforcement, it was about understanding. And Dwayne had learned that the hard way. But now, he had a chance to make a difference. There was a small pause on the other end. "I'm glad to hear that," Judge Jackson said. "But remember, this isn't about just learning. This is about changing the way you see the world. And that takes time. But more importantly, it takes action." Her words stuck with him. "Action. Have you thought about what comes next?" she asked. Dwayne paused. The thought had crossed his mind, but he hadn't fully considered what his next step should be. After all the training, the books, the seminars, there was still one thing missing. He needed to make a real impact, something tangible, something that didn't just stay confined to his thoughts or the pages of a book. "I think I need to make it right," he said, his voice more confident now. "But not just for me. For everyone who's been hurt by officers like me, who've been treated unfairly, who've been judged before they had a chance to speak." Judge Jackson's voice softened. "That's a good place to start, Dwayne. But don't forget, you're not just doing this for the people you've hurt. You're doing this for the people who are still suffering." Dwayne sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "You've seen it," Judge Jackson continued. "The way the system treats people. You know what it's like to make assumptions. But until you've seen the injustice firsthand, until you've witnessed the way people are targeted, profiled, arrested for no other reason than who they are, then you won't fully understand how deep this goes. And that's where the work is. The real work." Dwayne's heart raced. He had always been trained to think of justice as something black and white, a clear set of rules to follow. But now, he saw that it wasn't that simple. It was about the way people felt, how they were treated in their everyday lives. How every decision he made, every assumption, affected their world. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. "How do I make sure this doesn't happen again? How do I fix the damage I've done?" Judge Jackson's response was quiet, but full of power. "Start with yourself. Look in the mirror every day and ask yourself, am I doing everything I can to change? To make a real difference? The answers won't be easy. But you're ready to face them. A new initiative. Dwayne didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. His mind kept racing, running through everything Judge Jackson had said. He had made a mistake, a big one. But now, he saw that he had an opportunity to make a change. He could become part of the solution, part of a movement to reform the system, not just from the inside, but from the outside. The next day, he made a decision. He couldn't just keep learning about the issues and hope things would get better. He needed to do something. Something that would make a real impact on the community he served. Dwayne drafted a proposal for a new initiative within the police department, a training program aimed at confronting unconscious bias. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. The car, a sleek black sedan, was pulled over at the side of the road, its engine humming softly. Officer Dwayne adjusted his belt, resting a hand on his holster as he approached the driver's side window. A routine stop. That's what it was supposed to be. But something about the situation felt off. The woman inside didn't look panicked. She didn't look nervous, either. Instead, she was calm, too calm. Dwayne didn't like that. He tapped on the window. License and registration. The woman, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her posture poised, turned toward him with an expression that was unreadable. Without a word, she reached into her glove compartment, retrieved her documents, and handed them over. Dwayne glanced at her license. The name wasn't familiar, but there was something about her that felt authoritative. Too authoritative. "You in a hurry tonight?" he asked, flipping through the papers. The woman folded her hands in her lap. No, her voice was steady. Unbothered. Dwayne narrowed his eyes. "Any reason you were driving a little slow back there?" She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a crime?" He exhaled, already feeling his patience thinning. "It's suspicious. Especially this late at night." The woman held his gaze. "Driving the speed limit is suspicious?" Dwayne clenched his jaw. He'd dealt with his share of difficult drivers before, people who thought they were smarter than the law, who tried to talk circles around him. He wasn't in the mood for it tonight. "You live around here?" he pressed. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "Am I being detained?" Dwayne frowned. "I'm asking you a question." "And I'm asking you one," she replied smoothly. That was it. That tone, the calm, measured way she spoke, it irritated him. He straightened. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the woman sighed, shaking her head. "Officer, I'd like to know exactly what crime I've committed." "Obstruction," he said flatly. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Obstruction of what?" Dwayne's patience snapped. "Step out of the car," he repeated, more forcefully this time. There was a pause. Then, finally, the woman unbuckled her seatbelt. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. When she stepped out, she adjusted her blazer, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. She was taller than he expected. And still, completely calm. Dwayne grabbed his cuffs. "Turn around." She didn't resist. Didn't argue. But as he locked the cold steel around her wrists, she spoke in a quiet, even voice. "You just arrested a judge." Dwayne's heart stopped. He froze mid-motion, his fingers still gripping the cuffs. For a second, the words didn't register. But when they did, his stomach dropped. A judge? No. No, that couldn't be right. He looked at her again, really looked at her. The confidence. The poise. Dwayne's story became a beacon of change within the department, inspiring other officers to confront their own biases and work toward rebuilding the trust that had been broken. The initiative continued to grow, gaining more support from the community, and Dwayne found himself at the forefront of a new era in law enforcement, one where officers weren't just enforcers of the law, but also guardians of justice. Judge Jackson's words echoed in his mind, guiding him every step of the way. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about change. And Dwayne had learned, once and for all, that change was the only way forward. The success of Dwayne's initiative started to ripple through the department. What had begun as a personal journey of self-awareness and responsibility soon evolved into something larger, a movement within the police force to redefine what it meant to serve and protect. Dwayne found himself being called into more meetings with city officials, community leaders, and fellow officers. The town halls, once tense and full of distrust, now felt more like collaborative spaces, places where both the police and the community could come together to discuss solutions, share stories, and build understanding. The department started making real changes, with mandatory diversity training becoming a part of every officer's annual development. The changes weren't overnight, and they weren't always easy. Some officers resisted, some still held on to old beliefs, and some were simply afraid of what change might mean for their jobs. But Dwayne remained unwavering, reminding everyone that doing the right thing wasn't about ease, it was about creating a future where people of all backgrounds could trust the police again. Judge Jackson remained a guiding figure for Dwayne. She had supported him from the beginning, and her advice had helped shape his understanding of the broader issues at play. Their relationship had evolved into a partnership. One where they both worked together, not only to bridge the gap between the police and the community, but also to dismantle the systems that perpetuated injustice. One afternoon, Dwayne sat with Judge Jackson in her office. The papers on her desk were piled high, but her focus was on him, listening intently. "Dwayne," she said, her voice calm, "you've made some incredible strides, but there's still a lot of work ahead. Change is constant, and it's a fight that never ends." Dwayne nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. We've come a long way, but there are days when it feels like we're running in place. It's hard not to feel discouraged." Judge Jackson smiled softly. "That's the challenge, Dwayne. The fight for justice doesn't have an end date. But it's not about the destination. It's about the progress you make along the way." Facing the hard truth despite the progress in the department, the media never let go of the initial story. But for the mindset that had led to those actions. He met with his supervisor and explained everything, from his feelings of guilt to his newfound understanding of his own biases. The supervisor didn't offer excuses, but instead, listened. They talked about training programs, and the supervisor suggested that Dwayne take part in some of the diversity and inclusion workshops the department had been considering for a while. In the weeks that followed, Dwayne did the hard work. He attended seminars, read books, and listened to people who had faced the same kinds of assumptions that he had imposed on Judge Jackson. It wasn't easy. Sometimes, the weight of his realizations was overwhelming. But he knew it was necessary. He couldn't unsee the things he had learned. And the more he learned, the more he realized that the work was far from over. It wasn't just about one mistake, it was about changing a mindset that had been cultivated over a lifetime. But Dwayne was determined. He was committed to the change that had to happen, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been unjustly judged before they even had a chance to speak. Weeks passed since Dwayne had first faced Judge Jackson, and he had been working tirelessly to process everything he'd learned. Each day, he felt himself becoming more aware of the biases he had carried with him, the judgments that had been ingrained in him since his early days in law enforcement. But the more he worked through it, the more he realized it wasn't just his own mindset he had to change, it was the system. Dwayne sat at his kitchen table one evening, reading through a book titled Understanding Racial Bias in Law Enforcement. The pages seemed to hold so much more weight now, the words taking on an urgency he had never felt before. But it wasn't just the words on the page that struck him. It was the stories. Stories of people who had been unjustly targeted, whose lives had been affected by assumptions just like the one he had made about Judge Jackson. He had read stories of families torn apart, of people wrongfully convicted, of lives lost because someone had assumed their guilt before giving them a chance. Dwayne leaned back in his chair, the book in front of him but his mind far away. Could he really change? Was this something that could be undone, or had he already caused irreparable harm to the people he had sworn to protect? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. The name that appeared on the screen made his chest tighten. It was Judge Jackson. "Hello?" he answered, his voice tentative. "Officer Dwayne," her voice came through the line, calm and steady as always. "I wanted to check in on you. See how you're doing." Dwayne hadn't expected the call, and for a moment, he was caught off guard. I'm doing better, Judge. A lot better, actually. I've been doing some work, reading, learning. Trying to understand. Teaching officers to recognize their own prejudices, and ensuring that they treated everyone with the respect and fairness they deserved. It wasn't just about race. It was about ensuring that every officer understood the importance of fairness and justice, no matter who they were dealing with. The initiative would include outreach programs with local communities, town halls, and discussions designed to foster understanding and build trust. It was time for the department to listen. As Dwayne submitted his proposal, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He was no longer afraid of facing the truth. He wasn't afraid to confront the biases he had carried, and he wasn't afraid to admit that he had been wrong. The months that followed weren't easy. Dwayne faced criticism, not just from his colleagues, but from some of the higher-ups in the department. They didn't believe in the changes he wanted to make, and they were vocal about their doubts. But Dwayne stood firm. He knew the work he was doing wasn't just for him, it was for every person who had ever been treated unfairly. He took the hits, the harsh words, and the resistance in stride. Because he knew that change was worth fighting for. One day, Judge Jackson called him again. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks, but the moment he heard her voice, he knew that everything he had been working for was starting to take shape. "I'm proud of you, Dwayne," she said. "This is the beginning of something good." Dwayne smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't fixed everything, but he was on the right path. "Thank you, Judge," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Months passed since Dwayne had implemented the new training initiative in the department. Slowly but surely, things began to change. The feedback wasn't always positive. There were those who felt threatened by the changes, by the introspection that was now required of them. But Dwayne didn't back down. He knew the road ahead was long, and he wasn't going to let resistance stop him from doing what was right. One chilly afternoon, Dwayne was walking through the precinct when he was stopped by one of his fellow officers, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for being tough but fair. The officer had been skeptical of the new initiative from the start, and Dwayne had braced himself for more pushback. But what happened next caught him off guard. "I heard about your program," the veteran officer said, his voice rough. "I've been thinking about it, some of the stuff you said in those sessions." He looked at Dwayne for a long moment before continuing. "You know, I didn't think it would work. I thought you were wasting your time." "But," the officer's eyes flickered with something almost like respect. "But I see what you're doing. And I think you might be right." Dwayne stood still, absorbing the words. He had never expected a moment like this, especially not from this officer.